So, hello and welcome to the latest edition of the CyberGen Compliance Talks podcast, the podcast where I talk to leaders from across different industries, but really at the kind of cutting edge of technology, compliance, and the security world. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Ryan Grey, who's the CTO at Mara. Ryan, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, David. It's a pleasure to be here.
Pleasure to have you on. And Ryan, for those who aren't familiar with either you or the business, could you give us a bit of an introduction and background on yourself, please?
Yeah, so start with myself, as you say, Ryan, CTO at Mara. The first part of my career, it's a bit of a mixed bag. Started in a software consultancy, but instead of being a consultant, I started working in product, as you do. So I worked for a company called Scott Logic. They were trying to launch a product called Shinobi Controls, which was a charting library for iPhones. So it was a super interesting way to start out. And then quickly, after about 5 years, jumped over to the consulting part of the business. And then I've spent many, many years doing consulting, software consulting ever since, and gradually moved into technology leadership. I was head of technology for a product company, Grid Smarter Cities, for a couple of years. And then the founder of Scott Logic reached out when he was setting up Mara, and ticked a lot of boxes for me. And so headed over to Mara as head of technology. Mara, who are Mara? Mara are a power platform consultancy. So what's interesting about that in light of my career prior to that is that the majority of my career was in, and I only call it this now that I work in low code. My career was primarily in pro code. So I spent a lot of time writing code like for other organizations. And then when I started working in low code, needed a term for where I used to be in. So hence pro code. Sometimes I've heard it called high code, which I think is a pretty cool title as well. And so why is that interesting and different? I guess a lot of the things that used to take a long time, although we can get into this later, in pro code were theoretically a lot quicker in low code. And the low code tooling tends to be a platform that a customer to Mara organization would adopt as a platform. And then try to build their own stuff using that platform. So as a consultancy, it's very interesting because in pro code, you would basically go in and build the thing for them or be part of their dev team to build the thing that they're building internally. Whereas with low code and power platform, you might be doing that, but you might also be going in to help them adopt the platform, which is a very different type of work. And it introduces all sorts of things like how do they govern that platform and how do you help them govern that platform. So yeah, that's a whistle-stop tour of my career and who Mara are.
Amazing. Love it. Well, that's really useful context. Diving a little bit deeper then as to kind of what you do day to day at Mara, you talked about, power platform consultancy and gave us a bit of a kind of flavor of what that is. But, what does your day to day look like? What can you tell us about the kind of customers and companies you work with?
Yeah, I mean, I wish someone would tell me what my day to day is meant to look like, because I work on the organization is very small. We're about 15 people, and so what that means is that I'm just getting involved in like absolutely everything, like across. I often talk of it in terms of left hand side to right hand side. So left hand side being all of the pre-sales, sales, discovery, exploration, figuring out what they want built. And then middle of the work might be helping them adopt the platform and building. And then very right-hand side is handing over and making sure that they can run the thing once, as a consultancy, once you've left. Because the worst thing you can do as a consultancy is storm in, do the thing to them, and then leave. And they're left sort of dazed and confused as to what's just been deployed, and they don't know how to run or maintain the thing. So we think a lot about that at Mara as well. And I suppose what that means for my day-to-day is that I can be involved in any one of those things, like across that left-hand side to right-hand side at any given moment. That's fine while we're a small team. If we were to scale, we would probably look at introducing like a bit more routine and process there. So yeah, when I'm involved in pre-sales, that might be involved in sort of early conversations with people who either already have Power Platform or are looking to adopt it, and figuring out which of our services they might need to take a look at. It might also involve a little bit of sort of delivery management. I've done a bit of that here at Mara as well, just making sure the projects tick over nicely. And then another thing that I'm constantly trying to do is, I say we try to do, is make sure that the dev team are kind of like ahead of the game, like all the time. Like as a consultancy, you're there to be the expert, to help the customer build the thing or adopt the thing. And one of the knock-on effects of what's going on with AI and Microsoft's like heavy push, like for Copilot and AI, is just the sheer volume and speed of the releases like that are happening. So if you look at the beginning of 2025, Copilot Studio was a twinkle in the eye of Microsoft. And then if you look at the end of 2025 and where we are now, beginning of 2026, it's now this full feature platform where people can use it to build agents and deploy them into their tenants. And to go through that as a consultancy, we basically have a quite a well-structured process, despite what I was saying about it being a bit chaotic, a well-structured process around technical research, like to make sure that as these things are being announced, we're digging into them, building things like in that technology, deploying things internally, so that when we get to general release, we're able to guide other people on those things. So yeah, a mixed bag.
So it sounds like your current role and the kind of the breadth of that role, the whole kind of horizontal layer that you kind of explained there, is giving you such a unique perspective that you're not just looking at it from a technical problem, but it's also from a how do we actually enable the customer? I
Yes.
think you gave that example earlier of, quite traditionally you might have dev teams in going and building something, but if no one knows how to use that thing, that's a failure on the business part. But in that kind of typical, more siloed nature of larger organizations, it just ends up with finger pointing. The
Yes.
customer comes back and say, you've built something, but we don't know how to use it. That's a dev problem. Whereas for you, that kind of remit, you need that end-to-end scoping. What do they actually want? What do they need? What's technically possible? How do we build it and actually ensure that we're driving engagement on the customer side? Sounds like a fascinating kind of perspective, and probably, I'm guessing, different from maybe some of the other roles you've been in prior that may be a bit more regimented.
Yeah, absolutely. So my earlier career in software consultancy, I suppose there were kind of two levers that made that very different. One was my level of seniority, and the other was what I was saying about like pro code and low code. So with pro code, it used, and this might be an interesting conversation, it used to be the case that they were building a thing, they were adopting a platform. Like, sure, they might have a strategy to adopt like a technology stack, but adopting a platform is something slightly different. So my work, because of that, tend to be you were sort of like a hired gun that would just go in and, bums on seats. You just padded out there. A lot of the time you padded out their dev team, and that's what I did quite a lot of. So the skill set there was learning their tech stack quite quickly, and just learning to kind of culturally fit in, like with another team's or an organization's way of working. And you would do that quite rapidly, like over and over. I say rapidly, it's every sort of 6 to 18 months. Some projects were a lot longer. So 6 to 18 months. Yeah, as you say, that was quite a... It feels strange now to call it constrained, because still the bandwidth within that is still quite significant. As we're all aware, being a software developer is it's a creative endeavor, but in comparison to the low code side of things, as you say, what we're doing is we're sometimes just going in and building a thing, but that's far less interesting. So we've had that a couple of times where the organization, quite frankly, didn't really care what it was being built in. They just cared about the outcome of the app or the solution that was being built. We're actually a little bit mindful of taking on that kind of project, because when you are a Power Platform consultant, what real success ends up looking like is that, you use the word enablement. Real success looks like you've gone in and you've enabled that organization to use that platform. And fine, you might have built a thing for them, but you've also left them with the governance, the guardrails, the mechanisms for innovation, as well, so that they can use that platform in a controlled, governed way, but in a way where it makes it accessible to the people that are interested in the platform as well. So that introduces this concept of citizen developers, which is a thing that's kind of starting to crop up in sort of the AI world as well, where you need a strategy in place and rules in place that describe to people that are interested in the platform but not software developers by trade, what is it safe to do? What can you and can't you do inside of this platform? So yeah, that type of work is massively different, and it leads to the services that we have being not just managed delivery of go in and build a thing, but we have a lot of, we have a center of excellence service where we go in and we assess what's the current landscape of your adoption of Power Platform, what guardrails do you need put in place. We have a citizen developer service, which is where we go in and we can set up a strategy to make sure that the way in which you are governing your platform allows for citizen developers to come and work within the platform in a safe way. So that might be looking at how the Power Platform environments and the data loss protection policies and how you promote from one environment to another. There's all sorts of insane things that you have to think about once you start to do these things. If your citizen developers can go in and build any kind of application, well, what happens if it sort of goes viral within that organization, this app that the citizen developer has built, and they share it with their initial team, which is 10 people, that gets shared out, 100 people are now using it, but wait a minute, you never put in place the sort of the data governance around that for it to be that big of a thing. Who knows what data is going in and out of that application at that point, which is why it's really important to have that strategy in place. So yeah, hopefully that helps to describe the not trivial difference between the two sides of the coin there.
I'm looking forward to kind of delving in, as I know we will do, to the compliance and the governance side of things, because I think it's such an important thing to dive into. But I guess to provide the kind of context before we do that, can we talk a little bit about your customers? And I'm not asking for kind of names, but just sort of understanding the types of businesses you work with, what some of the kind of characteristic traits in terms of size, in terms of industry, and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've done work with public sector, some local councils, some charities. We've also done work with financial services as well. I think one of the reasons that it seems quite popular with public sector is that public sector is constantly trying to do more with less. So this idea of citizen developers, this idea of, we don't need to train up more and more developers. We can just have the people that are already doing all of this other work, solve their own problems. So it's on paper, it's very attractive. The reality of that is slightly more nuanced. So yeah, I think that's why it's popular with that type of customer. However, in some of the, I was going to say bigger domains and industries. Not that you can't have big public sector, but in the more of the private sector, I guess is what I mean. You do have, as I say, financial services and others like professional services, and that sometimes adopting it. I guess professional services is a good example of where people are working, they're cobbling together spreadsheets and things like that to run the operations of their business. And where people are running things on spreadsheets, that tends to be a very good smell for where a low-code platform, something like Power Platform, is going to be extremely good, extremely useful. And with the private sector and larger organizations and industries, I do think that low code was very interesting in where it sits, like within their strategies. So not normally a strategy is something like buy versus build, and it will look something like that. So as a CIO, you'll either be looking to buy in your CRM or your ERP, or maybe there's something a little bit more custom or unusual about the solution that you're looking to get solved. And so maybe you look around and you can't quite find something off of the shelf, so you decide to build internally. And then that's where a low code strategy can be interesting, because the thing that you're looking to build is extremely custom and weird to your domain, like something very specific and unusual, where you just can't seem to find something off the shelf that's going to help you. If it's extremely custom, then the strategy is normally reach for pro code and do a custom build of the thing. Whereas if it lands somewhere in, it's people have cobbled together spreadsheet stuff, maybe we don't want to pay the license for something gigantic and off the shelf. So let's look at low code tooling here. This might be helpful as a strategy. And I do think that the buy versus build can sometimes kind of squeeze out the idea of low code. It's something that not every organization has. We do find that some of the bigger organizations do tend to have a low code strategy in there, and they work hard to try and make that work. And I suppose I keep mentioning, we might talk about this later, to be a bit more specific about this. The thing that I keep hinting at is that AI and the use of AI tools like Claude Code and Codex in the pro code world starts to make the pro code world look, smell and sound like some of the stuff that I've just talked about in what was the low code world, in that, if you don't need code anymore to write something, you can describe it in natural language. You see tooling like Replit and Lovable start to appear. You can have business analysts, like project managers, product owners starting to build things in, and I'm going to do air quotes, pro code, where they haven't written a line of code. And so what then that starts to introduce is, how do you govern those things? How do you govern those types of citizen developers as to what they're producing in their organization? Because the mess that they can get themselves into, in theory, I think is far greater than the mess you can get yourself into with a low code platform. So those two worlds are actually starting to kind of merge weirdly and start to overlap quite a lot as well. So, you hear phrases like low code is dead, long live low code thrown around, meaning platforms like Power Platform and UiPath maybe starting to be supplanted by the AI tooling. But what Power Platform and UiPath and others are doing is they're basically embracing it and bringing the AI tooling and natural language creation into the platform. And so that natural problem that being able to write a pro code application as a non-developer, all of the danger that starts to bring in, it should mean that local platforms like Power Platform have an advantage in that they already have mechanisms for, how do you control your APIs and your connections to those APIs? How do you control the data flow, through data loss prevention policies, which are a first-class thing in these platforms. So if they get it right, yes, those two worlds are starting to collide. But if they get it right, they have the answer to a lot of the problems that are starting to come out of the use of AI-assisted coding tools.
So if I've understood that right, initially I was going to say, so what's the impact been? And you've kind of answered that, because one would suspect that it would be a net detrimental effect to the low code,
Right.
to low code. But as you sort of mentioned there, what Power Platform have done is they're essentially bringing in the capabilities from the sort of pro code, Claude and whatnot, but then also providing the kind of the governance and the kind of the data, the security and whatnot around that. So you're giving people just the capability, but also the trust element that's important. So it sounds like it's the best of both worlds. How's that kind of message landing? And I know you're not kind of alone at Mara in kind of getting this out there. You're kind of reliant on Power Platform and such forth. How is the market kind of responding to this?
Yeah, it's a good question. You do hear people mention things like Claude Code, Claude Cowork, and things like that. So it's clear that customers, they're aware of it. They ask questions around it. I do think that a lot of the customers that we speak to and talk to are already like bought into Microsoft and Power Platform basically. So it tends not to be a difficult conversation to have. They're already bought into it. They already want to use, get the most out of some of the licensing they already have. I mean, this is another thing to mention is that when you have things like M365 E5 and there's A and F licensing as well, you tend to get access to some of this stuff for free. So it tends to be quite an attractive like prospect anyways. So customers are generally going, we've got this licensing, we've got access to this platform. Like, how do we get more out of our licenses, more ROI out of our licenses? And then, yeah, they will have their, like, if they're a larger organization, they will have their like pro dev teams, like looking at things like Claude Code and Codex. So yeah, generally not a difficult conversation to have. I mean, the one thing that I would say, just to make sure that this is a nuanced conversation, and I'm not coming across biased as low code Power Platform, is that I love Claude Code and I love like building things using Claude Code. And another way in which like the two worlds are colliding is that Microsoft is starting to open up the ability to build, I mean, this sounds like a contradiction, but the ability to build the low-code tools in pro-code ways. Now, why would they do that? The reason that they would do that is because of exactly what I've just been saying, is that the AI-assisted coding tools allows developers to become supercharged to build things faster. It also maybe, I'm going to say big emphasis on maybe, allows non-developers to do things as well, but that's a big maybe. So what Microsoft are trying to do is like hedge their bets and say, well, if we open this up like to like allowing people to build stuff in a more sort of code-driven way, but they're not really going to be writing lines of code. They're going to be using AI to tell it like how to develop these things. But it's really an avenue to allow Claude Code and Codex to build like Copilot Studio agents and like Power Apps and things like that. So I'm not sure how familiar you are with the terminology, but they're releasing things like a Power Apps MCP server. So you're going to be able to have and a Dataverse MCP server. So you're going to be able to have your coding agents like interacting like with these things. They also released a GitHub Copilot and Claude Code Skill to allow those coding agents to develop Copilot Studio agents like much quicker. So that's enabling the capability for agents to build agents. So yes, what that means is that it hasn't been a difficult conversation so far, but there are a lot of good answers there, which mean that they're not necessarily contradictory things. Like those worlds are really starting to merge.
Awesome. And you've obviously painted quite a clear picture. Well, I say clear. Some of these things are kind of pretty confusing. What's sort of going on? It seems quite contradictory, as you mentioned. But painting a very kind of clear picture of the evolution within the Microsoft stack of it being that kind of twinkle in the eye to actually being something that's quite front and center. And we've spoke about kind of moving away from Microsoft. We've spoken about Claude and some of the other kind of AIs and what's going on there. Shifting focus for a second, I speak to a lot of leaders on this podcast at conferences and whatnot, and I think the general consensus is it's a bit of a minefield from a regulatory standpoint at the moment. all businesses are grappling with and wanting to adopt AI, but they're not knowing what the latest regulations that are coming out, what it actually means for them. So I'd love to see and understand how you're seeing kind of these compliance conversations show up with, the conversations you're having with clients and prospective clients, but also how that's sort of impacting your work at Mara.
Yeah, great question. And there's a lot of different angles to possibly attack that from.
It wasn't a simple question, was it? Sorry.
No, it makes it a good question. So I suppose that sort of thing crops up in a few different ways for a consultancy. I suppose the biggest way in which that crops up for when you're building stuff for someone else is that the onboarding of the partner. So we get called like a partner often, and those clients or customers onboarding us like into their organization so that we can be a trusted partner. Like, so that there's a key word, trusted. And part of what they do is they will often have questionnaires, cybersecurity questionnaires, and like other types of onboarding processes that you have to go through. And part of that is like sometimes they ask for, do you hold certain certifications, which I guess proves like that you are compliant with certain standards. So some of the stuff that we see is Cyber Essentials Plus, ISO 27, a bunch of zeros and then a 1. So that frequently comes up. So we are used to answering those questions, those types of questions repeatedly. It's very important, but it's very time consuming. And can be very frustrating I'm not sure if I should reveal this, but what I should say from the consultancy side is that it can be frustrating in that everyone asks nearly the same questions, but not quite the same questions. Which creates quite the problem. Interestingly, AI is helping that with us internally. You often come across conversations where we're starting to talk about, should we be getting back to the buy versus build? Should we be finding a off-the-shelf product that's going to help us with this sort of thing? At the moment, I mentioned 13 people. So what we do is we just have our in-house stock of answers, and then we have AI that helps us cobble together a first draft to a questionnaire, which must have a human in the loop review of it to make sure that it's accurate. And that is helping us to speed up answering those sorts of things. But that's kind of like the first place in which compliance and regulation kind of occurs as a consultancy. Another kind of interesting way is that once you're working with a customer, it really depends on the project. Who knows what regulation, what standard they have to adhere to? So you have to adhere to something to be a trusted partner and be allowed to develop stuff for them. But then they, in their strange and wonderful domain, wherever it is, they have a certification that they're having to earn or maintain. An interesting one was a local council that we had. They were running a materials testing laboratory for building materials, roads and highways, a testing laboratory, I believe it was. And I can't remember the name of the standard, but they had an ISO standard that they needed to adhere to. So then we had to have certain standards to become the partner, but then we were building software that would help them attain this certification for the standard as well. So there's a big chain of compliance there that we get involved in. And I guess the other thing, which is tangentially related, is especially when I mentioned public sector and charities, we've worked in a few healthcare settings as well, and PII comes up a lot in healthcare. And that's something where we have to have our act together on that for GDPR and making sure that everything is belt and braces.
Yeah, I have no doubt. And presumably if you're dealing with healthcare, HIPAA does HIPAA kind of come into it as well?
Yeah, I don't think we ever actually hit HIPAA, to my knowledge. I could be wrong on that. Yeah.
Sounds like you've got enough going on without that.
Sure, yeah.
So then moving on to the governance side of things, because I think this is a really kind of important topic. And in fact, I was actually at a networking event here in Manchester yesterday, and governance seemed to kind of dominate a lot of the conversation. Naturally, when sort of AI comes up, it's like, well, how do we actually govern, and how do we actually set the kind of guardrails around what AI can and can't do? So would love to kind of hear about, mentioned that governance is a large part of what you do and what you enable and provide to your clients. Can we talk around that and some of the sort of the challenges, particularly from a governance standpoint in the world of AI?
Yeah, absolutely. So governance in the world of AI, I definitely have a lot to say in the world of low code, and I can sort of say how I think it applies to the world of AI. But yeah, for Power Platform, like I mentioned earlier, we have a service called the Center of Excellence service. There's two parts to it. One is a maturity assessment. So you basically go in and you assess the maturity of their Center of Excellence. So why am I talking about excellence when you've asked me about governance? Well, the Center of Excellence is basically, we think of it as it is a strategic way to control two levers in the organization. One lever being governance and control, the other lever being innovation. Right, so how much is the platform opened up over here, and how much is the platform controlled over here? So that's what a Center of Excellence is. So we go in and we assess on the control and governance side, how much control do you currently have in place? How well is it governed? And we give them a rating. And then on the other side, we assess, well, how well do you promote this tooling? How well do you train your users in the tooling? Have you identified champions within the organization that it's not their job to be software developers, but they're just extremely curious and they've managed to build things? Have you identified those people? I think the interesting thing about governance on one side and innovation on the other is that governance, if done badly, can just be a kind of a blocker and become treacle to the organization and just slow things down, which is why we think that a good Center of Excellence has the innovation lever as well. You have to be thinking about, you've put the right guardrails in place, which are enablers, like it's safety, so that the local devs and the citizen devs can come in and have confidence, that they can build these things and that they're not breaking some kind of rule or getting something wrong. So if you get those two things together, it's not treacle, you're not wading through treacle, it's confidence building. The people that are using the tooling begin to understand this is how it works. It's being explained to me from the top down, in the organization. I understand how this works.
And how really interesting, kind of drilling in a little bit more with that if we can, because I think conceptually completely understand it. I think on a practical level, presumably it's going to be very different for your different clients. So interested in understanding how you kind of frame and lead those kind of conversations in a way that kind of limits your blowback of it's not like, oh, Mara told me to do this or Mara told me to accept more risk. How do you kind of position this conversation? And I love that kind of two lever example or analogy. How do you get them to decide what's right for them, thereby, avoiding any sort of blowback?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I've caught wind a couple of times in early customer conversations where I hear things like, such and such runs our Center of Excellence. And I'm always a little bit kind of surprised by that. Someone's just running the governance and sort of innovation mechanisms for you. Now, that's not to say that can't be done in a good way. Maybe I'm being a bit biased in how I think should be done. Maybe there are successful ways of doing that. But I think what you hinted at is what I was hearing, in that conversation, which was, oh, we've paid somebody to go and do the governance and make sure all that runs nicely, and we're just gonna dust our hands off and just trust that works. I guess maybe that's something that some organizations do. They maybe see it as we pay amount X for then the ability to sit back and be able to point the finger when something goes wrong. But maybe that's a way that some organizations work. But we think, and I mentioned handover, when I was talking about the left to right before, we're huge on the handover aspect. We call it continuous handover. So this is part of the framing and the messaging, is that we talk about building things with, not building things with an organization, not doing things to the organization. So we don't do the center of excellence to them. We build it with them. We make sure that they understand very early on they have to be part of this. And it's kind of something that Mara wants to be the case. So when we're doing our pre-sales conversations and we're triaging stuff out, if we were to come across examples where they just couldn't put the stakeholders in at the appropriate seniority levels, that's not that they need to be all super senior, but you need a mix down the seniority ladder, to make sure that the governance is infused through every layer of seniority. If they can't put that in, they can't devote that time, then it's probably not going to lead to a very good outcome for either party. So we'd probably rather not be involved in something that looks like that. This making sure that it's something that they're building for themselves, and quite frankly, it's perhaps a strange thing for a consultancy to wish, but our hope is that by the time we've finished on such an engagement, that you don't need us to run the center of excellence anymore. They need to be able to run it when we leave, otherwise we've failed.
It's about empowering businesses and not creating sort of dependence on you as a consultancy. Are there any sort of final thoughts or anything we've not covered and things you would like to add to that?
No, not really. I mean, normally the final thought is what's AI going to do to things? And we've already covered that. The way that I think the prevailing theory is that those two worlds are merging, and that, I don't know, if you look off into a few years in the future, I think you're probably going to end up seeing, in the way that Power Platform tries to be or has tools so that you can govern the platform. I think you're probably going to see companies and solutions and the keyword being platforms that are there to govern the creation and development of AI dev tooling. So what AI dev tooling is allowed in your organization? How do you control the sheer amount of code that's being produced, the PRs that are being created? How do you make sure that your AI agents are only connecting to approved data sources and aren't running amok and doing all sorts of things that they shouldn't be doing? So I think that the things that Microsoft say Power Platform does, I think we'll see other platforms popping up. I'm sure that I'm just out of touch with some of that world, across the pond from low code to pro code. There's probably already platforms exist saying that they do this sort of stuff. But I wouldn't be surprised if we see some interesting new startup companies in that space as well.
Well, at the rate and pace of change, as you mentioned, we should probably book the follow-up podcast in for only a couple of months' time.
Absolutely.
But that will be our reality 2 months from now.
Yeah. 100%.
Well, look, Ryan, it's been an absolute joy having you on the podcast. I appreciate you taking the time and for sharing all kind of your insights from your world. And thank you as well on behalf of the listeners.
Yeah, thank you. It's been really great.